Thank you, Chairman and Chairwoman, and thank you for inviting us to come and speak and talk a little bit about the evolutionary approaches to managing risk. So before I start talking about that, you've been focusing a lot on methods and laboratory methods. Well, that data goes somewhere, and that data goes into analysis that inform regulatory decisions or private sector decisions. So it's a really important part of how we go about choosing, or how countries go about choosing how they're going to actually alter their regulations to improve public health. And I'm going to give you a little history about that in review so you can see why we're moving more towards risk-based approaches. So I'd poke in here. So I'm going to start by giving you some background and then talk about the different approaches that have been used to manage food safety risks. And give you that evolutionary perspective, because that's really important to understand why there are differences among countries, differences among the private sector and the public sector, and the move towards more scientific approaches being used today. And I'm going to talk a little bit about the sector's roles to doing that, and then I'm going to talk to you a little bit about what GIFSAN does in terms of our training and research programs. So we all know food by its very nature, if not produced or processed in certain methods or cooked in certain ways, it can be very risky. And so we know that it's very risky under certain circumstances, and we have different ways to go about trying to manage risks. And it's basically, when we think about what's happening in the government, it's the process that businesses might use or governments might use to evaluate potential adverse effects and develop ways to implement processes to reduce that risk of that hazard entering into the food supply so you don't have a public health concern. And it really is a formal process that's being used by governments to try to understand how they're going to go about reducing risks, to ensure that there's a certain level of safety to consumers. So we're interested in safety in terms of public health outcomes and also in terms of what's happening with businesses in the private sector. So when we think about what's happening historically, traditionally we've really talked about things in terms of hygiene, inspection, in-product controls, and it may include certain laws that have been developed and regulations or certain food control management processes. It can include laboratory services, which we've been hearing about, and mechanisms for information and education and communication to inform ways to reduce risks. And a lot of this really has relied on presidents, past presidents, trial and error, expert opinions, particularly when you don't have data from the labs. It may involve safety assessments. I know a lot of countries do chemical safety assessments. A lot of times it's been based on precautionary principles, professional judgment, zero tolerance, and ignorance. And none of these methods really are quite scientific. And that's why we've moved towards scientific approaches. They're really important because when you have disagreements and such between trading countries or actually different ways food is being produced, we're using towards more science-based approaches. So with a scientific approach, you would have like a food safety problem. You may look at the traditional approaches to trying to reduce that risk. And now we're moving into a situation where we're having more scientific information, more information that labs can produce, and we're trying to look at ways we can actually manage that risk, and we're using a process called risk analysis to do that. And that has been something that's evolved over time, and I'm going to talk about that, but we've moved towards that, and we're looking at risk analysis, so we're trying to analyze the risk and the different management options and communicate that to that. And we're moving to a much more modern approach towards protecting the food safety system in order to reduce public health concerns. And this is what we see happening around the world. So I'm going to talk a little about this, and I introduced the term risk analysis. And many of you, if you're from the laboratory perspective background, you may not have an understanding of that. But we're moving towards using the risk analysis paradigm, which involves looking at the risk assessment. Does this point? I'm not sure which one's the pointer. Let me go back. We're looking at the risk assessment, which looks at bringing a lot of the scientific inputs, so we're getting the data from the labs at different processes along the value chain. We're taking a risk management approach, looking how we're going to evaluate, how we're going to reduce and mitigate those risks, and that's going to involve policy. And then we're also communicating that, because if we don't communicate that to the stakeholders, it's very hard to alter their behaviors to change and reduce public health outcomes. It's also important to do the risk communication in order to hear the types of data that the stakeholders might have, particularly from the private sector, and how that can inform decisions. So we start talking about risk, which is moving more towards the scientific approach. We're looking at really how we can look at how we're going to alter the outcomes of undesirable outcomes. And this may be something in terms of a loss, in terms of illness and death. It could be a financial setback from a company or any sort of hazard. And we tend to use an equation to evaluate this. And the risk equation that we look at is looking at risk is equal to the probability times the consequences. So it's not just the hazard, it's the consequences associated with that. And in food safety, the type of equation that we're looking at is looking at risk in terms of exposure, which may be the number of hamburgers you eat, times the hazard, which would be the prevalence of that particular pathogen, if you're looking at that in terms of the microbial side, or if you're looking in terms of chemical hazard, you'd be looking at the chemical potential problem with that product. So that's what we do when we do those analyses, and we move towards a more scientific approach, because we're trying to use that to help inform decision making. And it's really important when it talks to those of you who are talking or involved in trade, and I wanted to bring this in because this is a big segue where if you're just producing for a local market, or you're producing for a regional market, or you're producing for international market. So when it comes to trade, those individuals who became members of the World Trade Organization, there was an agreement. That agreement basically was the legal grounds of international commerce, binding governments to keep their policies within a certain agreed limits. And it became really important back in the mid-1990s when we started having a reduction in the tariffs related to barriers of trade, which limited the amount of trade that was occurring. And there was a big concern that countries may have put up certain non-tariff trade barriers associated with sanitary and phytosanitary issues or technical barriers to trade. And these became very important. There are certain agreements that require the use of risk analysis. And these agreements I just mentioned, but these are those governing the use surrounding food and animal and plant health in terms of international trade. So the two most important ones that came to be with the WTO is the agreement on sanitary and phytosanitary measures, and the agreement for technical barriers to trade, and most recently, the trade facilitation agreement. Historically, the ones that we've been most interested in are, in terms of using risk analysis, is the SPS agreement. And these really try to identify ways you could apply standards at the same time avoid protectionist measures. And they became really important as those trade barriers start coming down. Countries are really concerned there may be these disguised barriers. Now, when I talk about the SPS agreement, the reason that's important, it recognized that countries had the right to have their own measures to protect animal health, plant health, or human health on the condition the SPS measures were non-discriminatory and not unnecessarily trade restrictive between countries with similar conditions of risk. And they had to be based on the use of sound science and internationally agreed upon risk analysis procedures. So that's where we see this move globally to using more science-based approaches. So though we have a movement towards that, different countries are different processes in implementing those measures. Agencies have different capacity within countries to use those methods, and the private sector is existing. Some of them use the measures and some of them don't. So this is why you see a lot of differences in approaches how we go about reducing and managing risks. So I just want to give you some examples of risk-based approaches. They may be used, a risk analysis can be used to inform a regulatory decision. It also can be used to establish performance standards. It can be used in terms of trade resolutions when it becomes a concern over a sanitary and phytosanitary trade barrier. They also are being used in the implementation of hazard analysis and critical control points, and also used to establishing acceptable daily intakes for chemical additives in food. Also estimation of maximum allowable exposure levels in terms of pesticide, and also used for labeling. So risk analysis is a tool, it's a technique that is being used around the world to establish these different limits, different regulatory requirements. So we hear a lot about this, but we don't always understand the evolution that has occurred. And when we've moved to, when we look at managing risks, we're looking at hazards. And historically, there are two different approaches. So the concept that you either have a hazard-based approach, which the mere existence of a hazard is enough to be grounds for considering the food unsafe. And now we also have the risk-based approach, where we're considering not only the hazard, but the probability and the likely consequence of an exposure to determine whether or not a food is unsafe. So, we have one gentleman that keeps talking about how is it different here in the region. Well, you may have different consumption patterns. So when you do the analysis, you're going to look at the region's consumption and how you're going to look at how you're going to manage risks. So you may have differences between countries based on consumption patterns, based on how the food's being prepared, and actually how the growing conditions and such. And all those things may affect how you look at how you're going to manage risk. And that's why you might choose to use a more risk-based approach than just a hazard-based approach. So I wanted to move a little bit to the evolutionary process, and people don't understand always when I talk about that. The whole aspect of using a more scientific-based approach has been an evolutionary process. And again, not all countries are in the same place on that. So traditionally, when we start looking at controlling food safety risks, we're really looking at something in terms of looking at what's as low as reasonably achieved. And that's where a lot of countries have historically approached how they're going to control the risk in their country. But it becomes a problem when what is considered as reasonable, as low as reasonably achieved, differs amongst different countries or different populations. And really what they find when you look at this ALAR principle, really what's considered reasonable really differs amongst different people, amongst different populations. So that makes it very controversial. And disagreement also arises when an industry is very heterogeneous in relationship to the technical capabilities or resources to implement different processes to try to reduce risk. There are problems in terms of disagreements when the technological capabilities or approaches differs between countries. Also, there are differences differences in agreements when there are no clear-cut means for trying to control hazard. You may have different approaches within a country, particularly when you have different value chains. And also there are controversies when the expectation of the country's consumers and the public health community differs from that what happens with the industry's approach in an exporting country. So this is where you may have disagreements. So we see changes, and changes have occurred. So what you see in a lot of countries in the early 1850s to the 1960s, there often was this approach, a command control approach. This is how we're going to go about reducing the risk. And it wasn't until the 1950s to the 1990s we see this movement towards good hygienic practices and the early movement towards HACCP, what you see countries trying to do. In the 1980s to basically the present, we have a lot of benchmarking of the HACCP process, particularly by the private sector. But in the 1995 to the present, we see the movement towards public goal-based risk management process. What's happened then? I talked about earlier the WTO and the agreement. That's when the requirements came into place using the risk-based approaches. So I wanted to give you that perspective so that you know it's not something that happened overnight. It's been a gradual evolution, and different countries are at different places in how they go about approaches that they go about trying to reduce the level of risk. but there has been that gradual change. So what we see, it happened in this last 2.5 decades, we see really a movement from hazard-based approaches towards more risk-based decisions. And it's really trying to aid governments and private sector to optimize and how to minimize the different competing risks and deal with the diversity in the population, in the marketplace, and deal with international interdependence of the marketplace. And that's really important because we're having a situation where increasingly food products are being traded across continents, and there's a potential to have what's considered a hazard in one country not be a hazard in the other country, and that's where you get disputes and concerns. And a lot of this movement towards risk-based approaches has been accelerated by advancement in risk-based decision tools. And I want to say, not only have you seen an evolution in terms of regulatory process, but you also have seen an evolution in how we go about doing risk analysis over the years. Many countries have their different policies of how they're going to go about trying to reduce risk. And when they look at public health policy and food safety risk, they're really, how they do manage it, they're really interconnected. You can't manage a risk by itself without working with what's required in the country by their regulatory structure. And understanding these roles of risk management becomes our basic concept really in terms of how we try to manage risks. And we have different sectors involved, and that's really important too, because you can't just do it solely by involving the public sector, you need the private sector involvement. And that's really important. And the responsibility for producing and marketing safe food really lies with the industry, but the role of the government is really to establish the stringency and equivalence of food safety systems and to ensure that the industry is meeting their responsibilities. And this often is confused in the mind of the public sector, or the public, not the public sector, but the public and the consumers, but these are the roles of the different groups involved in that. And when we think about looking at how we do that and why we're doing that, in terms of the public sector, really, when we think about food policy and risk management, these are really affecting societal decisions. And it gets really inherently complex because the public sector must balance the science with the existing food safety laws and regulations. And though a country may be a member of the WTO, they may not have the rules and regulations in place requiring these types of scientific analysis. And I see a lot of variation in terms of understanding what the countries need to do versus what they have in terms of the rules and regulations on their laws. You also have to balance the economic realities of the country and the food availability, and that becomes really important when you're in countries where you may say deem certain foods unsafe, yet a good portion of the population is relying on that consumption of that food. So you have to balance that, and you have to balance that also with the diverse interests of the stakeholders. When we talk about the move towards science-based approaches, we're really talking about the application of science knowledge within a framework of the laws that defines the risk management options and the limits that are available to regulatory agencies and the industry. And that's really important. It's not just about having the principles, but dealing with what exists and the framework that the country is using. And we have to think about that in terms of we go about thinking about how you pick the stringency level. And the stringency issue, when we think about in terms of food safety system, is really a relative attribute. And the stringency, often when we look at terms of regulation of food, is really based on a specific hazard in a food pair. And it's dependent on really looking at the probability of that hazard may occur, the severity of the hazard, the population affected, the extent it's being consumed, and is it avoidable? Are there potential for controls and alternative foods? And all this goes into the risk analysis, into the scientific approach, how you analyze the risk, and how you analyze it, how it may differ by country or by different consuming populations within a country. So these are things that go into those scientific analyses. Other important concepts is the concept of leveling the playing field. That's a really important process when it comes into regulation. In terms of looking at fairness concept, all companies need to play by the same set of rules. And basically, food safety requirements have the potential for hindering some companies from competing in the marketplace. So if crafted well, it really tries, the government regulations tries to level that playing field. And the analysis that supports those, the risk analysis that do that, are analysis that would be used to help inform that process. So there are a lot of different techniques out there to do that, to help a government create a policy that does level the playing field. Am I skipping? And then there's also the concept of equivalency. And that's really important, particularly when you look at how you manage risks. Basically, a food system should provide a similar degree of stringency, should be considered something, considering the concept of equivalency and something being equivalent. And that's important because we know that some of the technologies that a company may use or a country may be a very high-tech technology, but it may be equivalent to some of the less expensive technologies such as hand sorting. And this is looking at hand sorting in West Africa in terms of sorting for aflatoxins and groundnuts. And when they looked at the impacts, they actually were equivalent, and that's really an important process because it recognizes that different countries or different producers or processors may use different approaches to reduce managing a risk and evaluating if there's a risk. And they want to be able to maximize flexibility, fairness, allow for innovation, companies do their innovation, and make it really based on risk-based decisions rather than having one size fits all. And also another important part in these analyses that are done to affect regulatory decisions and is really to understand there's often a lot of uncertainty is really integral in terms of how we approach, how we inform regulatory decisions. So you talk about laboratory tests, but you're not testing everything. So there's some uncertainty about that, and we recognize some variability. And these are important concepts that we bring into our analysis when we form decision making. We recognize that they are integral to understand where we're uncertain, that we have to consider the variability in uncertainty of certain food and hazards. And when we do those, we often create safety margins to offset our uncertainties in the analysis that we do. And we may use precaution in some cases, but it should be proportional to the magnitude of the risk, the probability times plus the severity if there's uncertainty associated with it. So now we turn to how risk is looked at from a food industry perspective. So what I just talked about was really the movement from looking at hazard to using a risk-based approach from a public sector perspective. But in terms of industry, they still are using a combination of good manufacturer practices and HACCP. And those tend to be the gold standards worldwide for managing risks. And when we talk about that, when we talk about good hygiene practices, we're really talking about what are the best practices used by the industry at that time. So depending where you are on the value chain, it may be looking at primary production would be good agriculture practices. You may be looking at food manufacturing, and that would be involving good manufacturer practices. Or if you're in the food service, it may be the food code. But these are different good hygienic practices that are used primarily by industry. And the question is, when are these good, if these good hygienic practices aren't enough, well, then we have to look at different ways to reduce risk. So really, historically, we looked at the development and implementation of good hygiene practices. They have greatly been effective in reducing risk, and that's why they've been employed, and you see that being employed around the world. But these aren't always enough, really, to eliminate foodborne disease. And that has to do with looking at the remaining failures associated with specific activities where you have periodic failures. And this may happen due to treatments that to try to control the risk are insufficient to deal with the variability that we see in the food. There may be problems associated with reliability of personnel and equipment. And it may be actually the failure initially to identify the specific hazards. And this really has led to the movement towards the adoption of HACCP by industry. So you went from the good hygienic practices to this movement towards HACCP. And that has evolved over the years in industry. And HACCP really was that first approach where they tried, companies in the private sector tried to take a systems approach to designing how they're going to reduce risk. It really is a semi-quantitative risk management approach based largely on a qualitative approach to looking at a hazard and reducing that, and that would be considered a qualitative risk assessment. And the difference with that, when we talk about HACCP versus what's happening in society at large, we're literally looking at individual firms' ability to reduce risk, and that's what we see happening there. And that's based really on a failure mode effect, looking at what systems are going to have a failure and determine the consequences associated with that, and then modify the approach to how we reduce the risk. I'm going to skip over this because I'm a little behind. So what we realized when we started doing that and we started developing these approaches and industry started using HACCP, it was really effective for the HACCP programs, but you still had problems associated with that. You still had looking at the risk associated with that residual risk and looking at compliance risk and the residual risks. And this is where we see that movement away from looking at HACCP. So the risk-based decision criteria in HACCP are really set by the hazards considered significant, the critical control points identified, the critical limits out there, the frequency in which we're monitoring that, and the frequency and severity of the verification programs. And the question is, what happens when that's enough? And if it's not enough, too little is an increase in public health risk, and too much can reduce the quality, increase the cost of production. So that's when we see the movement towards the risk analysis framework. So we're moving away from the way it traditionally has been done, the way the private sector is doing it, to looking at that risk analysis framework that I talked about earlier, which looks at the risk assessment, looks at the risk management, which is really looking at the scientific inputs, looking at the policy approaches to managing that risk, and then communicating it. When we talk about managing risk, we talked about the assessment there, but we're talking about really what are the problems, how we're going to answer the questions, how does it impact the risk being described, and what can we do to reduce the risk that was being described. And that's really what the risk analysis management process is doing. When we talk about the risk assessment, we're interested in what can go wrong,
1 minute, please.
How can it happen, and what are the consequences. And when we're talking about communication, we're talking about how we're communicating to the audience. So that's really the evolution of that process. And you want me to stop now? Or? So that's really, I wanted to give you sort of the evolutionary background, how it all works. But that's where you see differences between countries and their approaches, and they're really working to meet those international guidelines. Thank you.